2 nights ago, I spoke in front of 3 people. 2 nights ago, I had traveled all the way across the country up to northern Montana, and I spoke to 3 people. So having about 75 here is great. Let me introduce myself. So Yate, Mark Charles Yinashia, Sin Bekadena Nishla, Dotor Haglini Basachin, Sin Bekadena Gasachedo Toruchi Nibashanala. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identity comes from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sin Bekadena Nishla. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Toa Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sin Bekadena. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toduchitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. Over the next hour to an hour and 15 minutes, I am going to talk to you about the Doctrine of Discovery, Abraham Lincoln, and Thanksgiving. I guarantee you it's not what you're expecting whatsoever. If you're looking forward to a great time with family in Turkey next week, you chose the wrong night to come here. I am going to, over the next hour, completely reframe Thanksgiving for you. I am going to warn you ahead of time. Yes, you can go ahead and get the lights down if you'd like to. I'll warn you ahead of time that I am going to destroy your understanding of Abraham Lincoln. And I am going to talk to you about some history that, as a nation, we really don't know how to talk about. Now, I have a bit of an advantage because the research I'm giving to you, I researched over the course of 10 to 15 years. The research on Thanksgiving and Abraham Lincoln, I had 5 years to wrestle with. If you Google Mark Charles and Thanksgiving, you'll actually see a series of blog posts over the course of 5 to 8 years where I was wrestling with that holiday. And I'm going to give all of that information to you tonight in the next 75 minutes. So you will feel overwhelmed. You will at one point or another look at whoever you walked in this room with and said, "Can we get out of here quietly?" You may even want to stand up and throw something at me. I want you to resist all those urges. Okay? Stay in your seat, unless you want to get up and go to the back for a snack. But stay engaged. There is a lot of things we need to learn how to talk about so that we can find a good way to move forward as a nation. Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. These are the words of Pope Nicholas V in a papal bull written in 1452. This papal bull, along with others written between 1452 and 1493, are collectively known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is the doctrine that the European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They did not see them as human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in what they called this new world and claimed to have discovered it. I'm the co-author of a book on selling truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. We actually have some copies for sale in the back, which you can get afterwards, both with cash or with a credit card. But the first sentence of the first chapter of this book says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands, but you can't discover them. Right? If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your car keys, your watches out. Art and I will come by and we'll discover them for you. Right? Clearly this is not discovery. But yet, this is what we credit Columbus with. but you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. Now, chapters 3 and 4 of this book detail how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like love your neighbor and pray for those who persecute you, to a doctrine of discovery that said you can kill people who don't look like, eat like, work like, or worship like you do. Now, we don't have time to go into that journey, but I want you to understand that the doctrine of discovery is a white, male, Christian supremacist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. So this is the doctrine that Columbus used when he came here and discovered these lands. Now, next week, we're going to be celebrating Thanksgiving, and you're probably going to have a lot of conversations about the first Thanksgiving. There is this mythology that said in 1621, there was this great multicultural potluck between Pilgrims and Indians, and it was this very massive kumbaya moment. There is a small semblance of truth in that mythology, but most of it is myth. There's a lot of things we don't talk about regarding the first Thanksgiving. So I want to take you just a few, not even a long, 5 years prior to the first Thanksgiving. From 1616 to 1619, there was in the northeast of the United States a plague that was going through the villages, the native villages, called the Great Dying. It was a disease that was brought over by the settlers, by the Pilgrims, and it was spreading throughout all of the native villages along the northeast coast. In the Wampanoag Mayflower 400, the 400 years of Wampanoag history, they wrote the most alarming period is known as the Great Dying between 1616 and 1619. A mysterious disease ravaged the region where the Wampanoag lived as their lands were explored in greater numbers. Entire villages were lost and only a fraction of the Wampanoag nation survived. In the winter of 1616 to 1617, an expedition dispatched by Sir Fernando Jorges found the region devastated by war and disease. The remaining people so sore afflicted with the plague that for the country was in a manner left void of inhabitants. 2 years later, another Englishman found ancient plantations now completely empty with few inhabitants, and those that had survived were suffering. So entire villages were left depopulated. Literally, a village that had hundreds of people one year, the next year had just bodies lying on top of bodies, and almost no one was left alive in the village. For 3 years, this plague, this dying, went through the Northeast. Now, in 1620, King James, and this is the same King James that ordered the translation of the Bible that most of you know, many of us know, the King James Version of the Bible, he was giving a charter of New England, where he was telling settlers they had the right to use some of these lands. And I want to read to you from the charter that he gave of New England in 1620. James, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and to all whom these presents shall come, greetings, whereas upon the humble petition of divers of our well-disposed subjects that intended to make several plantations in the parts of America between the degrees of 34 and 45. There hath these late years, by God's visitation, reigned a wonderful plague, together with many horrible slaughters and murders committed amongst the savage and brutish people there, heretofore inhabiting in a manner to the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of that whole territory, so that there is not left for many leagues together in a manner any that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein, nor any other superior lord or sovereign to make claim hereunto. Whereby we in our judgments are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time is come, in which Almighty God, in his great goodness and bounty towards us and our people, hath thought fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as they were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by such of our subjects and people as heretofore have and hereafter shall by his mercy and favor and by his powerful arm be directed and conducted thither. So as these settlers and colonists went through these lands and saw these villages of the Northeast depopulated, left with no one alive, their king said, "This is a gift from God. And because these lands are now empty and there's no one here to lay claim to them, we can now lay our claim over them." And therefore he wrote the Charter of New England. In fact, one of the reasons why the first Thanksgiving took place in Plymouth is because that is probably one of the lands that was left depopulated by native peoples during the Great Dying. In 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he says to the colonies that were here, the 13 colonies, that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonists. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land, and they went on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, "All men are created equal," the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used that inclusive term, "all men," is because their definition of who was human was incredibly narrow. This makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist document. Now, a few years later, the Founding Fathers wrote another document. This one began with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, if you keep reading, just a few lines a little further, not much farther down to Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 is the part of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not part of the Union, who is and who is not covered by this document. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you have to know is it never mentions women. Now, this is important, because if you read the entire Constitution, preamble down to the 27th Amendment, you will find there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There is not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. Maybe you say, "Well, Mr. Charles, that's how they spoke. This was Old English." Yeah, do you know why they spoke that way? Because they were sexist, right? Old English was sexist. Women didn't count. They couldn't vote. They couldn't work outside the home. Old English was sexist. There is not a corporation today operating on bylaws written in the 1700s. But we still run a nation in bylaws written and using the language of the 1700s. So Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. Third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? 1787, it literally left white men. And technically, you had to be a landowner to vote. You see, we don't talk about this frequently enough. The purpose of our Constitution, the reason it was written, was to protect the interests of white landowning men. In 1823, we had a Supreme Court case. This was Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two white men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from the government. The other one got the same land from a native tribe. They want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the John Marshall Court, considered one of the greatest Supreme Court jurists in our nation's history. And they had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. Who had the right to sell the land, the government or the native nation? They ruled that discovery is what gave title to the land. And then, because that might maybe perhaps imply the native nations had some sense of sovereignty, They went on to clarify and say, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Essentially, they stated that natives are merely occupants of the land, like a fish occupies water or a bird occupies the air. White people are the discoverers of the land, which then gives them the fee title, so therefore they are the true owners of the land. This case, along with a few others in the 1820s and 30s, create the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the Doctrine of Discovery were referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. I have a TEDx talk online called We the People, the 3 Most Misunderstood Words in US History. It goes into depth in some of this history and some of these Supreme Court cases. I want to highlight just a few things about the 2005 Supreme Court case. So, in the 1700s, the Oneida Indian Nation occupied about several million acres of land in central state New York. The George Washington administration reduced their lands to a few 100,000 acres, and then they passed a law stating only the Oneida Nation could live on those lands and only the federal government could purchase those lands. The state of New York continued to illegally purchase the lands from the Oneida Indian Nation until all the lands were bought up and the Oneida were moved out of the state. In the 1990s, the Oneida Indian Nation came back and they bought some of their traditional lands. They bought them full price on the open market. And they wanted to reestablish some of their sovereignty over those lands. Now, the lands they bought were within the city limits of the city of Sherrill. The city of Sherrill wanted their tax revenue, so they sued the Oneida Indian Nation in federal district court. The court ruled in favor of the Oneida, and so the city appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, and that original decision was upheld, so they appealed to the Supreme Court. The case was heard, I think, in 2004. The opinion came out in 2005. In the first footnote of the case, where they're establishing precedent, they reference by name the Doctrine of Discovery. They then go on to state that given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the area and its inhabitants, the regulatory authority constantly exercised by the New York State, and the Oneida's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They go on to reference another case that said it is impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been opened up to settlement, which was white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. They went on to state that, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Oneida sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the Oneida sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. Now, if that argument sounds familiar, it's because it's identical to the argument that they made in 1823. It just doesn't use the word savage. We've taken your wilderness, we've converted it to civilization, and we can't send it backwards back to you. So they conclude, we now reject the unification theory of the lower courts, and we hold that standards of federal Indian law, again, footnote 1, Doctrine of Discovery, and federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now this is shocking, right? Because she was a voice of dissent on an increasingly conservative Supreme Court, and she was known as someone who was fighting for the rights of the marginalized, which she was and which she did. However, because land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human, we're savages, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan doctrine, which she clearly demonstrated in her 2005 opinion. Going back a few hundred years, in 1630, John Winthrop was with a group of colonists. They were in what's called the Boston Harbor now. They were there to plant the Boston colony. And on board that ship, he preached a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he referred to the people he was with, the settlers he was with, as a city upon a hill. Now, he's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples to be a city on a hill, a lamp on a stand, shining their good deeds into this dark world. In his sermon, John Winthrop goes on to exhort the settlers in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bond of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Christian exhortations that you would hear at almost any church you would go to on a Sunday morning. End of his sermon, he did what many pastors do when they want to compel their congregants to heed their exhortations, which is he started quoting from the Old Testament. And he decided to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And God's reiterating the threats and promises of the land covenant. If you obey me, I will bless you in your lands. If you disobey me, I will curse you from your lands. And in this passage it says, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey, and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river. But in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that word to vast sea. Now, why does he do that? Well, they didn't cross a river, right? They crossed an ocean. So what's he implying? Based on Jesus' exhortation to be a city on a hill, based on the legacy of Old Testament Israel, they are standing on the banks of their promised land, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, who here has read the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua? God's pretty clear how the people of Israel are to take possession of their promised land, right? In Deuteronomy chapter 20, it says, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them as the Lord your God has commanded you. So promised lands for one group of people is literally a God-ordained genocide for the other. I refer to this sermon as the birth of the myth of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is not just about America is better than everybody else. It's that America has a unique relationship with the God of Abraham, different from everybody else. So that idea gets birthed in the 1600s. It percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains, we go past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, there's a Second Great Awakening. Middle of the 1800s, we coined the phrase manifest destiny. The belief that this nation has the God-given right to rule this continent from the East Coast to the West Coast, from sea to shining sea. Now, I want to talk some about manifest destiny. Two of the chapters in this book, the hardest chapters to read, are chapters 9 and 10. The reason chapters 9 and 10 are so hard to read is because we take the adage, the victors write the history. Right? We've all heard this adage before. We agree with it, right? This is the rules. If you win a war, you get to write about the war. Right? This is how that adage works. The victors write the history. Now, I want you to just do a mental exercise with me for a moment. Let's just pretend for a moment that Nazi Germany wins World War II. Okay, just pretend. Nazi Germany wins World War II. How would you imagine the Nazi historians would have recorded the legacy of Adolf Hitler had they won World War II? Well, he'd be their greatest leader ever, right? Brought them from global obscurity to global dominance. Had Nazi Germany won World War II, how would their historians have recorded the legacy of the Holocaust? Well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war, right? What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. See, when the victors write the history, they get to create a mythology. And this is dangerous. Now, that's not what makes chapters 9 and 10 so hard. What makes chapters 9 and 10 so hard is we take that adage and we observe that the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. We've never been invaded, we've never had a regime change, we've never been disarmed, we've never given up large tracts of land. We've never lost a war that matters. Every major military conflict we've been involved in, we have won. Technically, the Korean War's not over yet. We pulled out of Afghanistan and Vietnam, but didn't give up any lands. We've won every major conflict we've ever been involved in. And as a result, we, and by we I mean white men, have written their own history for 250 years. Now, if we were to take a survey around the country of who is the greatest president in our nation's history, the general consensus over the past 20 to 30 years would be this man, Abraham Lincoln. He is the man who abolished slavery. He is the man who won the Civil War. He is the man who did all of these amazing things for our country, right? And it's not even a partisan argument. The Republicans love to remind people that they're the party of Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican. The Democrats love claiming him too, right? President Obama, our nation's first black president, was sworn in with his hand on the Lincoln Bible. Especially as race relations have gotten worse in the past 20 to 30 years, the stock of Abraham Lincoln has risen. He has the largest monument in DC, and he has the most visited national monument in the country. Almost everybody agrees that Abraham Lincoln is our greatest president. And the reason chapters 9 and 10 are so difficult to read is because we take the adage, the victors write the history, and we apply it to Abraham Lincoln, and we demonstrate that we don't know crap about Abraham Lincoln. We don't. So I would like to introduce you to Abraham Lincoln, if I may. I want to introduce you to him the same way he introduced himself to the nation when he ran for Senate in 1858. In 1858, he ran against Judge Stephen Douglas for the Senate seat from the state of Illinois. It was known already that Lincoln was against the institution of chattel slavery. In those debates, it wasn't like the 30-second sound bites we have today. It was a series of 3 speeches. The first candidate would give a speech for about 20 minutes. The second candidate would respond for about 30 to 40 minutes. And the first candidate would come back for another 10 to 15 minutes and have another response. That was the debate. It was a series of 3 speeches. So in one of the debates, actually in 2 of the debates, Abraham Lincoln felt the need to clarify his stance on race. And he said, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the 2 races living together on terms of social and political equality. Insomuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, self-proclaimed, unapologetic white supremacist. Why would he introduce himself that way? Why was this so important in 1858. Well, if you think back to the last midterm elections, right, of 2022, we had a Supreme Court ruling just prior to that that overturned Roe versus Wade. What this did is it made Roe versus Wade one of the central debates during the midterm elections, and every candidate had to take a stance on where they stood on Roe versus Wade. In 1857, there was another major Supreme Court case. It was called the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision stated that formerly enslaved peoples were not protected by our nation's Constitution. So the debate of the 1858 midterm elections was, where do you stand on the civil rights of Black people? And Abraham Lincoln made it abundantly clear he absolutely agreed with the Dred Scott decision. He had no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes or allowing them to hold office or intermarry with white people. He absolutely believed that they were inferior and they were not going to be a full part of this society. He went on to lose that election, and Judge Stephen Douglas was even more the white supremacist than Abraham Lincoln was. They both agreed on white supremacy. They disagreed on the institution of slavery. Judge Douglas thought we needed enslavement to keep white supremacy intact, and Abraham Lincoln thought we could keep white supremacy in place without the institution of chattel slavery. That was their debate. But when he was elected in 1860, it caused a lot of angst in our country, especially for the southern states. And so the morning of Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, the country was in a tizzy and the Senate was working furiously to try to hold things together. The morning of his inauguration, the Senate passed what was called the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment stated that no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the powers to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service. The Corwin Amendment constitutionally protected enslavement in states where it already existed. They passed that in the early morning hours just prior to Abraham Lincoln's inauguration. In his inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln absolutely had to address race, and he said apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property, enslaved peoples, and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all of the public speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that, and now he begins quoting from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I have no purpose to directly or indirectly interfere with the institution of slavery in states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so and have no inclination to do so. He then goes on to address the Corwin Amendment. He said, I understand I propose amendments to the Constitution to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service, to avoid misconstruction of what I have said, holding such a provision to now by implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. So Abraham Lincoln absolutely supported the idea of constitutionally protecting enslavement in states where it already existed. And even though the president has no role in amending the Constitution, he took it upon himself to, once it was passed by the Senate, to mail this amendment out to all of the governors, asking them to ratify it. It was never ratified. Had it been, this would have been our 13th Amendment. Now, in 1862, Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, he wrote a scathing op-ed asking Abraham Lincoln to keep his campaign promise and immediately emancipate enslaved peoples. Abraham Lincoln already had the Emancipation Proclamation written. It was in his desk. But he was concerned because there were 4 northern states, the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that allowed enslavement, but had not seceded from the Union. And he was concerned about losing the support of the slave owners in those 4 states if he emancipated slaves around the country. And so to respond to this op-ed by Horace Greeley, Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter, and he said in his letter, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not to either save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." So Abraham Lincoln sought to put the mind of the slave owners in the northern states at ease by telling him, "I'm not doing this because I give a crap about black people. I'm doing this to save the Union." January of 1863, Abraham Lincoln finally did emancipate enslaved peoples. If you read the Emancipation Proclamation, it's very specific where people are emancipated. They're emancipated in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Missing from the list is Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And just to let you know, he didn't forget about them. He said accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And enslaved peoples in those northern states didn't get their freedom until after Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Now, the cornerstone of Abraham Lincoln's legacy is the 13th Amendment, right? Most people think the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. They think it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. But to understand this amendment, you have to understand the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln was asked if the Declaration of Independence applies to the black race. He responded by saying, "I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men are equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity." He's not saying some men are taller and some men read more. He's saying one group's inferior and one group's superior, and he already made it very clear which one he thought was the superior race. He was also asked about making citizens of black people. He said, "Well, Judge Douglas has not asked me that before, and he'll have no occasion to ask me again. I tell him very frankly, I am not in favor of Negro citizenship." He went on to say, "It's my opinion that the different states have the power to make a Negro citizen under the Constitution of the U.S. if they chose. If the state of Illinois had that power, I should be opposed to the exercise of it." So as president, Abraham Lincoln had a dilemma. He wanted to end chattel slavery, not because he gave a crap about black people, but he was trying to save the Union. But he didn't want black people to be a part of society. So what do? Do you send them back to Africa? What's the solution? Well, the solution was you put a clause in the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, where the party has been duly convicted, shall exist. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery, it redefines and codifies slavery under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. This is the same criminal justice system that today has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. This is comparing us to NATO nations. And when we break it out by race, it's even worse. We incarcerate Hispanics and Latinx at a rate of 831 per 100,000, American Indians rate of 895 per 100,000, and black people at a rate of 2,306 per 100,000. White people are incarcerated at a much more palatable rate of 450. So we just have to be clear. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery. It redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. The Constitution protects it. And today we are using this amendment to systemically and massively remove the civil rights of people of color. Again, Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist until the day he died. But this isn't shocking, right? We know enough about Abraham Lincoln to know we shouldn't read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? We know there's something in there we don't really want to see. Who here's been to the Lincoln Memorial? Keep your hand up. Who's been to the museum at the base of the memorial? Okay. At the memorial, there's a small museum about the size of this room. There's on the walls of that museum, there are these plaques, these marble plaques, about the size of the glass in the doors back there, about 4.5 feet tall, maybe 2.5 feet wide. They have different quotes on them from different parts of Abraham Lincoln's presidency and his legacy. On one wall are these 5 plaques with his thoughts on the Union. And in the middle of this wall is the plaque that says, "I would save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is not to save or destroy slavery, it's to save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There is a plaque hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to Abraham Lincoln, Black lives don't matter. It's not their lamenting the fact that he believed this. It's not their protesting the fact that he believed this. It's hanging there celebrating the fact that this was his view. Now that's only half the story. We haven't yet talked about the relationship with Native nations. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed 2 bills. He signed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres, anyone willing to go west and homestead, for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act allocated the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. This was the spring and summer of 1862. Prior to 1862, the years before that, the Dakota Nation signed a treaty with the US government that if they gave up some of their lands, they would get the provisions they needed to get through the winters in Minnesota. The prior winter, 1861-62, was really harsh. Many of the Dakota died, and they did not receive the treaty obligations that was promised by the US government. In the fall of 1862, some of the Dakota warriors were out hunting, and they came across a white settlement, and they went into the settlement to steal some eggs. They were confronted, a fight broke out, they killed some of the settlers, and then they went back to their people and reported what they had done. There was a lot of debate. What do we do? Do we turn these young warriors in? Do we go to war? Because what do we do? Again, they had not been receiving the treaty obligations that they were promised, and they were not certain they would make it through another Minnesota winter. So after a lot of debate, they reluctantly decided to go to war. A very violent, very bloody war broke out between about a month in the fall of 1862. A lot of casualties on both sides. End of the war, half of the Dakota fled north into Canada. The other half surrendered. Those who surrendered were immediately put into military tribunals. They were now being tried by the very people they were just fighting on the battlefield. Their trials lasted just a few minutes. They were conducted in languages that Dakota didn't understand. Witnesses were being shared. Many have concluded these trials were legal shams. End of the trials, over 400 of the Dakota people warriors were found guilty and condemned to death. That order was passed up the chain of command. No one could bring himself to execute it. Finally, it came to Abraham Lincoln, and he couldn't even do it. But instead of ordering retrials, he decided to change the criteria of what warranted a death sentence. Under his new criteria, only 2 of the warriors were going to die. And now he was afraid what was already happening, which is that the settlers were going to take matters into their own hands and start their own rebellion, which was already happening. So a second time, he changed the criteria of what warranted a death sentence and landed on the magic number of 38. So the day after Christmas, 1862, people came out and celebrated as the largest mass execution in the history of our nation took place, with the hanging of the Dakota 38 as ordered by Abraham Lincoln. In January 29 of 1863, just a few months later, I'm going to read what the Smithsonian Magazine reported. In a frigid dawn of January 29, 1863, Segwitch, a leader among the Shoshone of Beaogi, or Big River in what is now Idaho, stepped outside his lodge and saw a curious band of fog moving down the bluff towards him across a half-frozen river. The mist was no fog, though. It was steam rising in the sub-zero air from the hundreds of U.S. Army foot soldiers, cavalry, and their horses. The army was coming for his people. Over the next 4 hours, the 200 soldiers under Colonel Patrick O'Connor's command killed 250 or more Shoshone, including at least 90 women, children, and infants. The Shoshone were shot, stabbed, battered to death. Some of them were driven into the icy river to drown or to freeze. It's the bloodiest massacre in the history of our nation, and a massacre that almost nobody knows anything about. When I was writing on Something Truth, I researched Indian massacres. I didn't come across the Bear River Massacre. A friend of mine, now he's a friend, Darren Perry, a former leader of the Shoshone Nation, has written this book and is literally traveling around the country, educating our nation about the Bear River Massacre. It has been buried and overlooked, and almost nobody knows anything about it. In February of 1863, the next month, Abraham Lincoln nullified the treaties of all the native nations in Minnesota. Just nullified all the treaties. This was in response to the Dakota War of 1862. In March of 1863, without treaties and no new negotiations, he now ordered the removal of all the native nations from Minnesota. They were put on barges, they were marched out, they were shipped out, they were put on wagons, they were moved out of Minnesota and into the Dakota Territories onto a reservation that was not suitable for their size. It was a very unjust and even violent removal. In the fall of 1863, Abraham Lincoln's General Carleton, who was serving in the Southwest, gave this order about my people. Henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or you move. The army captains, like Kit Carson, went through our lands. They hunted our people, they burned our homes, they destroyed our livestock, and they butchered they destroyed our crops, and they butchered our livestock. They hunted us around our traditional lands. In the Book of the Navajo by Raymond Friday Locke, he records that by the middle of December, most of the weak and aged had died. There was hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol. Nearly 10,000 of my people were rounded up and forcibly marched down to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds of them died of starvation and exposure along the wall. D. Brown, in the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, records it was a wretched land. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets and herded them into adobe-walled compounds. To shelter themselves from the rain, they had to dig holes in the sandy ground. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. It was a bad place, and although escape was difficult and dangerous over the watchful eyes of the soldiers, many were risking their lives to get away. Nearly a quarter of my people died while in prison there. They called it a reservation, but it wasn't a reservation. It was a death camp. a death count that was approved by Abraham Lincoln on January 15 of 1864. In the spring of 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the second half of the Pacific Railway Act. This doubled the amount of land and resources given to complete the railway, and it gave the railroad companies the mineral rights to the ground to financially incentivize them to build quicker. In 1851, a reservation was established. A treaty, it's the Fort Laramie Treaty, established the lands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in eastern Colorado. In 1858, the gold rush saw prospectors and settlers overrun those lands as they sought to seek gold in the Colorado Rocky Mountains and in California. In 1861, they had the Treaty of Fort Wise, where they created a smaller reservation in eastern Colorado. In 1864, November 29, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were on their treaty lands. They were waving a white flag of surrender and an American flag to show they were there peacefully. It was early in the morning. The warriors were out hunting, and it was older men, women, and children in the camp. And a U.S. Army, a Union Army led by a Methodist pastor, came over the hill, and he ordered all of them slaughtered. It was later reported that in celebration of this massacre, the soldiers paraded the genitalia of the Cheyenne and Arapaho down the streets of Denver. One week later, in his annual message on December 6 of 1864, Abraham Lincoln reported that 1.5 million acres were entered under the Homestead Law, and that the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. What made him so confident now that they were going to complete Manifest Destiny and get all the way to the east, to the west coast? They had already completed the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the Dakota War of 1862. We had the Bear River Massacre in 1863, the Long Walk in 1864, 63 through 68, and the Sand Creek Massacre had just happened a week prior. This is a map of the early routes of the railway. The primary map or route had made it to Omaha, Nebraska. It had to go through eastern Colorado, southern Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and come out near San Francisco. There was a planned northern route that was going to go from Duluth, Minnesota through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and come out near Seattle. And there was a southern route that was going to go through the territory of New Mexico, Arizona, and come out near Los Angeles. After the removal of the Dakota Winnebago, after the Bear River Massacre, after the Long Walk, and after the Sand Creek Massacre, you can see Abraham Lincoln had effectively ethnically cleansed the primary routes of the northern, central, and southern transcontinental railway. Not only was Abraham Lincoln a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist, but he was one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. He's also the president that brought Thanksgiving into the modern era. Prior to him, Thanksgiving was a regional holiday celebrated throughout the fall. He had two Thanksgiving Day proclamations in 1863 and in 1864. I want to read parts of one of them for you. Needful diversions of wealth and of strength, from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense, have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlement. That is a lie. And the mines, as well of iron and coal, as of the precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. Remember the promise of this of the railway. Population has steadily increased, and the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God. So in the middle of Hanging of the Dakota 38, the Bear River Massacre, the Long Walk, and the Sand Creek Massacre, twice Abraham Lincoln called for a national day of thanksgiving and asked the country to thank God for the fruits of the genocide that he is actively committing. It's no wonder his monument in DC is based on a temple in Greece. Why is he considered our greatest president? Why? Is he the great emancipator? No. Is he the great unifier? Well, he did do a lot to unify white people. We credit him with winning the Civil War, but that's not the war he really won. The war he won was the War of Manifest Destiny. Had he won the Civil War, but not been able to ethnically cleanse the northern, central, and southern routes of the railway, we would probably remember much about him as we do about his predecessor and his successor, and I bet you can't even name their names. Did he abolish slavery? No. He constitutionally protected white supremacy. This actually isn't that shocking of a comparison once you know the history. But what's troubling is this wasn't an isolated presidency or a set of isolated incidents. I want to talk about the 19th century. This is the century our history books refer to as the century of expansion. It's during the 19th century we add 30 new states to the Union. I made this chart. This is the US history from 1775 to 2016. Every year in blue is a year I found we were in a declared state of war or armed military conflict against another nation or entity. Every year in red is every year I found we fought native nations. You can see from 1811 to 1886, we had almost 75 straight years of warfare against native nations. These are the list of the wars and massacres we fought primarily during the 19th century. Clearly, this wasn't a century of expansion, right? This was a century of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Again, during this century, we had the Indian Removal Act. This was the act of Congress that gave the US military, in practice, the right by force to remove native nations from their lands in the east to empty lands further in the west. Of course, we had the horrible legacy of Abraham Lincoln from 1860 to 1865. In 1879, we had the Indian boarding schools. These were government and church-run schools. The stated goal of these schools was to kill the Indian to save the man. Native children were taken from their homes, put into these military-style boarding schools. They were punished for speaking their languages, punished for practicing their culture. The stories I've heard firsthand of people who survived these boarding schools are gut-wrenching. The stories of abuse, mental, physical, emotional, and sexual, rip your heart out. And the last of these schools didn't close until the 1970s and 80s. We know a little bit more about the massacre at Wounded Knee. At least this gets mentioned in many of our history books, but we don't know the story. In 1890, the US and the Dakota Nation were negotiating the surrender of some of the Dakota chiefs. And they met at Wounded Knee. Neither side trusted each other, and both sides were very heavily armed. The US Army had what are called Hotchkiss cannons there. These are multi-round cannons. They're accurate up to a few hundred yards. They can shoot several rounds a minute. No one quite knows what happened. They don't know if this was started by a native warrior or a US soldier, but someone fired a gun. And chaos just broke out. The US government had 4 of these Hotchkiss cannons there. There's a ravine at Wounded Knee, and many of the Dakota people, men, women, and children, fled into the ravine to seek shelter from the guns that were raining down bullets from above. Something we don't talk about at Wounded Knee is the US Congress awarded 20 Congressional Medals of Honor. to the soldiers who participated. And 3 of those medals, the one for William Austin, the one for John Grisham, and the one for Albert McMillan, were awarded specifically for their actions to flush the Dakota people out of the ravines. You can look up Congressional Medals of Honor by war and by conflict. If you look up Medals of Honor by the Indian War campaigns, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, and this is what our nation looked like in 1840, between 1839 and 1898, the U.S. Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor to the U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian War campaigns. End of that period, this is what our country looks like. You can see we made it all the way across from the East Coast to California. During this century, the majority population ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million. The native population collapsed from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing your math, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing your math, that's almost twice the rate of genocide that Hitler had in Nazi Germany. So just to be clear, between 1839 and 1898, the US Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor for the genocide of American Indians and the ethnic cleansing of this continent. And we knew what we were doing, right? The first governor of California, Peter Burnett, in 1851, giving his State of the State address, stated that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't heal these people. We can't stop its spread. And he's not saying famines come and we can't feed them. He's literally saying we can't stop killing these people until they're extinct and we've completed manifest destiny. And this, of course, is right in line with Promised Land theology, where we're told in Joshua 10 that Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathe, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. In the 1500s, the world population was 480 million. In 1900, it was 1.6 billion. That's a 3.39% rate of growth. Europe went from 82 million to 300 million for a 3.65 rate of growth. Africa went from 63 million, and even with the horrors of the slave trade, still grew to 123 million for a 1.782 rate of growth. North America went from 0 people, right, because we were all savages, to 76.2 million. And the indigenous population of Turtle Island went from a very conservative estimate of 6 million down to a low of 237,000 for a 0.0395 rate of growth, which is actually a rate of death or genocide of 96.05%. That's higher than the Rwandan genocide, what happened in Nazi Germany, and even what happened in the 19th century. So while this comparison is troubling, it's this comparison that makes our stomachs churn. Yes, we can easily compare Lincoln to Hitler. That's not a hard comparison. But we as a nation are actually not very different from Nazi Germany. We just won our wars. It's the only difference. We won our wars. So we got to write our own history. And we created this mythology about Abraham Lincoln and about who we are. So what do we do? What's the solution? I am convinced the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race gender, and class. It's a conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. But I would not call ours Truth and Reconciliation. Reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which is inaccurate. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation. Conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute. We have to create this peace for the very first time. And I'm convinced we need to do it sooner rather than later. One of the quotes I love is this quote used by George Erasmus when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And he used the quote that says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where communities to be formed, he said, common memory must be created. I love this quote because I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problems, especially regarding race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers this mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of enslavement and Jim Crow laws, of boarding schools and Indian massacres, of internment camps, of segregation, mass incarceration, families being ripped apart at our borders. And there's no common memory. And there's actually no point in US history that we can look back on and say, at that point, we had healthy community across racial lines. That point doesn't exist. We don't need racial reconciliation, we need racial conciliation. We must create this common memory. I'm not trying to cancel people, I'm not trying to shame people. I am traveling around the country, teaching this history as honestly and as straightforwardly as I can, because I want to create common memory so that for the very first time, we can have this healthy community. It's why I wrote my book, Unsettling Truths, and it's why I'm in front of you today. I want to thank you for taking some time out of your weekend to join me tonight. I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. I want to thank you for squirming but not leaving. I'm happy to take some questions, but I just want to say thank you for joining me for this dialogue. We want to take some time for some Q&A. I want you to know that at the back of the room after this presentation, I do have some books for sale, and I have a special. You can buy a signed copy of the book, and I can take credit card or cash. They're $20 each. But I also have a special where if you buy a pack of 10 books, for the purpose of doing a book study in your group or your church or your organization, I will give you 10 signed copies of the book, and we'll give you a free virtual Q&A anytime you want to schedule with me over the next year. So it's a great way to get some more dialogue with a broader group of people if you'd like to do that, and I can do that for it at the back table there. But I think we have some, do you want to do a Q&A now?
Sir.
Yes. Okay.
Just tell them if they need the microphone.
Yeah, so if anyone would like to.
You speak into yourself.
I will bring the microphone to the questioners.
Thank you very much. It's just fascinating, interesting, educational. I think what I get out of this is what I think the critical race theory idea is trying to do in schools. My question is this. President Barack Obama's favorite president, I think, is Abraham Lincoln. And if you were in a one-to-one debate about Abraham Lincoln with Barack Obama, who's a pretty smart guy, in my opinion, How do you think, what would be the biggest point of contention between the two of you on whether, on the merits of Abraham Lincoln? And then real quickly, do you, by your definition of genocide, is what's currently happening as we speak in the Middle East qualify as a genocide?
Two very good questions that in no way, shape, or form put me on the spot. So first of all, President Obama, I have a lot of respect for the man, and I have a lot of respect for his intellectual curiosity and the way he wants to know and understand, and he's not afraid to ask questions. I feel fairly confident that if I could get President Obama to sit in the room with you and listen to this lecture, he would agree with me. I'm not saying he knew this beforehand. And the reason I say that is I want to read for you one of the endorsements we got on our book. If you buy a book in the back, you'll see an endorsement from Mark Knoll. Mark Knoll is a Civil War historian. I want to read you what he wrote. Why should I endorse a book when I do not agree with some of its historical judgments? Answer: for the same reason you should read it. Charles and Raw attack a principle, the Doctrine of Discovery. They review an evil history, the United States treatment of Native peoples. They challenge a persistent stereotype, American exceptionalism, and psychoanalyze white America in denial about the nation's history. The entire book, even when you think things could be evaluated differently, will make you think and think hard about critically important questions of Christian doctrine, American history, and God's standards of justice. I'm willing to bet he wrote that review thinking about chapters 9 and 10. Now, Sun Chan Ra and myself, my co-author, were very specific, and I led the charge on this about how we presented that history, because I knew there would be a lot of pushback if we didn't handle it right. If you read the chapters, even if you listen to my presentation, I didn't quote any historian experts. I didn't quote any experts on Lincoln or historians on Lincoln. I quoted Lincoln. And I put him in historical context. And then I connected some dots for you. I did that because had I quoted historians and had I quoted experts on Lincoln, I promise you this Q of A would have been filled with questions about this analysis technique and that academic idea and so on and so forth, because you would have wanted to hide from dealing with Lincoln behind the academic arguments. And so the fact that Mark Knoll, who was clear, he did not agree with the way we put things together here, but he read it, he's like, holy crap, I can't. Like, you got to read this book because it's going to make you look at things that you can't unsee and deal with things that by doing the lecture this way, I made you deal with what Lincoln said, and I made you deal with what Lincoln did. And I am quite certain, if I could somehow get President Obama in a room, Barack Obama in a room, to listen to me, I think his intellectual curiosity and I think he would not dispute me. And he would probably, because again, I drank the Kool-Aid for most of my life too. It took me 5 years, it took me a year to go from it. I had the same attitude almost everyone else had, which was Lincoln was a good guy, but he also had some problems. I knew I didn't want to read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? I knew that. I knew he was a good guy, but I also knew there were things I didn't want to know about him. And literally, as those things started coming down for me, it just opened my eyes bigger and bigger and bigger. And I could go on for a few hours telling you the stories about my experience of how I uncovered some of these things. So yeah, so I think that's I trust Mr. Obama enough to think, I think he would not dispute me. Regarding what's going on in the Middle East, And again, we could be here all night. So I'm writing a second book. My second book is called Decolonizing Faith. I'm writing it as part 2 to this book. This book looks at the way the church and the nations misuse the scriptures to justify violence and genocide and enslavement. So we critique the United States and its promised land mythology and how that justified genocide and elevated Abraham Lincoln. We critique that. We did not critique the passage in Deuteronomy where God told Israel to kill everybody. My next book critiques Deuteronomy. And I look at that. And I look at that, again, I'm going to walk a fine line because I don't want to have white theologians or white people arguing about white dead theologians and what they've said hundreds of years ago, and I want to avoid that. And so I'm writing this next book as the grandson of boarding school survivors. My grandparents were boarding school survivors. And I'm writing this as someone from a people who endured the ethnic cleansing of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm writing about it, and I'm saying, looking at the scriptures and saying, I'm a Christian. I was raised in the church. I've been a Christian my entire life. But because of the traditions of my people, I also know Creator from outside of what I was taught in the Bible. If you read the introduction into this book, I talk about my journey to watch the sunrise. And I rise several mornings, well, not as much anymore because my daughter's, I got to take me to school. But for a few decades, for over a decade, almost 20 years, I've been watching the sunrise on a regular basis. And that has this is what my people have done for centuries, thousands of years. And it has transformed my relationship with Creator as I know Creator, not just through a book, but through watching the sunrise, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and now decade after decade. And one of the questions I'm raising, and I'll do this as quickly as I can. So, if I look at Creator, how do I do this very quickly? This is impossible to do quickly. So, if I look at the story in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we have Creator identified in Genesis 1 as Creator. Then later in Genesis, when we have the flood narrative, Creator is still identified as Creator, but now Creator is acting in a way that is not consistent with Creator, because Creator says, I'm going to kill everybody. Right? Which is a weird thing for Creator to say. Then you have Abraham, and now Creator identifies as the God of Abraham, and Creator tests Abraham's allegiance to him by saying, are you willing to kill your son? And Abraham says, yes, I am. Then again, in later in Genesis, with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Creator says, I'm going to kill everybody, and does, with fire and brimstone, destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And then when Moses is getting commandments from, first it's Creator, then the God of Abraham, and then it becomes the God of Israel, and as Moses is on top of Mount Sinai with the God of Israel getting the 10 Commandments, the people get impatient, and they start worshiping a golden calf, and they say, this is what brought us out of Egypt, and Creator sees that, and says to Moses, okay, get away from me, I'm going to destroy my people. And then when they get into Canaan, the God of Israel now says to the people of Israel, now I want you to kill everybody. Before it was Creator killing everybody. Now it's I want you to kill everybody. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we see Creator identifying as king. When the people ask for a king, and Samuel says they're rejecting me as prophet, and Creator says they're not rejecting me as prophet, they're rejecting me as king. So we see this progression of Creator identifying as Creator, God of Abraham, God of Israel, and eventually king. And as you see this progression going away from Creator and more towards king, you see this pattern of consistent and genocidal violence happening. Okay? Now, Abraham is the father of three religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. There's a war going on right now in Israel, and the three participants are the United States of America, Israel, and Hamas. All three of these countries have nationalized their religion and used it to justify extreme violence against their opponents. The US has done it with Christianity, Israel has done it with Judaism, and Hamas does it with Islam. Okay? We are so focused on what's different between these three nations, and no one is saying, hold on, all three of these nations accept Abraham as the father of their religion. They all accept the Torah as holy scripture. They all accept this narrative of creator moving from creator to becoming king, and they all accept this genocidal violence that moves between them. Maybe instead of talking about what's different between these three nations and these three religions, we have to talk about what's similar. Maybe that's the problem, is all three of these nations have used their religion to justify national violence against their opponents. And maybe if we can start to acknowledge that problem, we might be able to fix what's wrong. So I can't say of what's happening in it. I will tell you, I've been to Israel, I've been to Palestine, I've sat with the Palestinians, I've sat with the Jewish, and I've sat with the Bedouins. And we never hear about the Bedouins. The Bedouins are the true pawns in this conflict. If Palestinians take over a piece of land, they move the Bedouins. When Jerusalem take over a piece of land, they move the Bedouins. The Bedouins have no political power, and they're moved around like pawns. If you want to complicate any debate on peace in Israel, bring up the Bedouins. No one will know what to do with it. And so it is an absolute quagmire. It's a mess. But I think it's a mess because these three nations and these three religions are actually a lot more similar than they are different. And they hold a lot of the same values, and we've never had a discussion about that. And what does that mean? I hope that helps answer your question. Thank you. Meanwhile, yeah, my book is hopefully will be coming out in 2025, but it's wrestling with all of these issues. So I don't want to get too much into your snack time. I know they brought a lot of great food and snacks here, but I love these conversations. I love these sorts of dialogues. I will be in the back by my book table. Do we have time for one more question?
No, I was just going to say, due to the comprehensive nature of the first question.
Yeah.
That would be the only question.
Well, thank you all very much. And again,